Díobhain is agus fáilte. Hello and welcome. It's Misha Amy, the Crafty Kyluk. And today I'm going to be talking about the Night of the Blessed Turf. And that's turf as in TURF, the stuff you burn at the fire, and not TERF, those really bad feminists. So turf has been somewhat of a topical issue of recent in Ireland, with the Irish government banning turf being sold and used by anybody that can't cut or grow their own. I will leave a link to that topic down in the description below so you can read a little bit more about it. But the night I'm talking about happened in 1832, so 190 years ago, exactly 190 years ago, because it started on the 9th of June. The Night of the Blessed Turf is also called the Night of Straws. So I will get into all the meanings and what happened on this night with turf in a second. First, I want to welcome you to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Amy. I am an Irish witch, a pagan, and also a historian in training. And I make content about Irish history, folklore, food, and magic. This topic covers two of my favorite interests, folklore and history. So the Night of the Blessed Turf, as we'll get into in this video, is not only a historical night amidst a historical pandemic, but also is an example of just how fast news can travel in Ireland and also how folklore can happen in real time. Before I go on, I do want to give a little bit of a content warning. I feel like Irish history should just have content warning Irish history, but particularly 19th century and early 20th century Irish history is quite turbulent. So I will be talking about the following, or touching on the following topic. So economic hardship and famine, civilian agitation against oppression with mentions of rioting and violence, anti-Catholic sentiment and anti-Irish sentiment, anti-Protestant sentiment and sectarian issues, disease and death, because we will be talking about pandemic, specifically the cholera pandemic, and mentions of the Catholic Church and apparitions of the Virgin Mary. I won't be going into detail on this. It will just be mentions throughout the story and to kind of give historical context, but because this is a lot of the stuff we're actually seeing in the news recently, it's good to just give a warning. So if you're not in the headspace, you don't have to listen to it. You can come back at a later time, or if you're not in the space at all, that's okay. I do really feel like these content warnings sum up Irish history though. So I know we're all probably sick of living through and talking about pandemonium and disease, but this is an interesting snapshot of life in Ireland 190 years ago during or at the very start of the cholera pandemic. And as I said, an example of how fast news can travel through Ireland and how folklore can develop in real time. Interestingly as well, we can see through reports that I will touch on how the story can change, how stories can change, how regional variations develop. And also it's really important to note that during this time, there was no Facebook, no WhatsApp group. There was no technology. There were letters and people moving from place to place. So it's really, really impressive. So to set the scene, I'm going to talk briefly about Ireland in the 1930s and the start of this cholera pandemic. So in the summer of 1832, Ireland was in a little bit of a crisis. The decade of the 1830s had started with economic hardship and real economic depression following agricultural failings. So poor potato crops in 1829 and 1830 had led to near famine conditions in some regions. Agricultural prices had fallen to a new low, and while by 1832 most of this was over, it was still having a profound effect on rural populations. This is what we mean when you hear Irish people talk about An Gcirta Mór and trying to kind of point out that the famine wasn't our only famine. There were actually a few of them, and potato crop failings bringing us to near famine conditions on a few occasions. So because of this economic hardship, you had a lot of agrarian violence brewing. And in fact, it had been brewing for some time. Just over 30 years before this, you had the 1798 rebellion. The 1798 rebellion really deserves its own video, or probably its own series. So I'm going to park that for the moment, but it is worth looking up if you are interested in 19th century Irish history like I am. because it really gives you a good indication of the existing tensions as you come into the start of the 19th century. There were secret societies as well that were active in Leinster, but also Munster, Connacht and Ulster to a lesser degree. There was political agitation against taxation in Kilkenny around 1830, and that had spread to Leinster and Munster in the 2 years following. There were scenes of violent encounters and riots between civilians and also the British Army and police. While all this tension and agitation wasn't necessarily new, this is just setting the scene for what the climate of society was like politically, socially, as we enter into an epidemic of cholera in 1832. So from 1817, the first of the 4 great cholera epidemics or pandemics had started in India and had spread westward. Insert rant on colonialism here. Cholera then appeared in Moscow by 1830, and by 1831 had reached England. The first case was reported in Britain in October 1831 in Sunderland, and on the island of Ireland, the first case was reported in Belfast in 1832. So in Belfast on the 18th of March, and then just a week later in Dublin, reaching Cork eventually by the 12th of April. By the 8th of May of the year 1832, cholera had reached 14 out of the 32 counties. A cholera board was set up in Dublin to give public health advice and also advice on hygiene and how to stop the spread of the really awful disease. Cholera, I'm not going to go into the symptoms or the aspects of cholera, but it was a really horrible disease. But this cholera board was sort of the NPHET of the time. NPHET was our National Public Health Executive Emergency, National Public Health Emergency Team during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still ongoing even though they have been disbanded. Most likely it was probably more so due to the fear of cholera than the actual prevalence of the disease itself that led to the strange and chaotic events of June 1832. So at this stage you might be asking, Amy, what does cholera have to do with blessed turf? Well, by June of 1832, there had begun this kind of popular panic regarding the cholera outbreak that was happening around the country. And in an article talking about the night of the blessed turf, S.J. Connolly writes, the earliest recorded appearance of popular panic centering on this threatened appearance of cholera came on the night of Saturday, 9th of June, in the northern part of County Cork. A report on the episode was forwarded to Dublin Castle 2 days later by Major General H.D. Barry of Ballyclough House. The panic, according to his account, began with the news that the Virgin Mary had appeared on the altar of the chapel at Charleville and had left there certain ashes which she warned were the only protection against cholera. So Mary appeared in this church, left a pile of ashes and advised the witnesses to split the ashes up into 4 piles. Each of them were to take 1 pile and bring it to their house, put it up in the rafters, and then they were to go to their own chimney, take ashes, 4 sets of ashes, and go to 4 subsequent houses to repeat the same process. And this was to go on and on and on until everybody had been given blessed ashes. This caught the attention of many, many people. So this was reported in various different places, from people sending letters between police stations, reporting to army and generals and lieutenants, and also caught the eye of some social commentaries. So Humphrey O'Sullivan was a very noted 19th century social commentator. He also collected folklore, and he was a school teacher in Callan, County Kilkenny at the time. So Humphrey O'Sullivan, or Eilíomh O'Sullivan, wasn't very kind in how he portrayed Irish rural people in this night of panic. So on the 11th of June 1832, in his diary, he wrote the following: the lower classes of the Irish are a credulous people. Some practical joker sent a fool out with a small piece of charred stick or some other bit of kindling which had been extinguished in Easter water or holy water, and told him to divide it into 4 parts and to give it to 4 persons in 4 houses, telling them that the cholera would kill them unless each of them did the same thing. By this means 16 persons and 64 and 256 and 1024 and 4096, etc., etc., got this fire until the entire country was a laughingstock for products. So aside from being an important historical record, although very biased, on this night in question, and the work of Humphrey O'Sullivan is very important when we're looking at 19th century history and looking at the social climate at the time. This is also a lovely example of how middle class Ireland will look down on working class Ireland, and in 190 years this hasn't really changed a whole lot. So as I was saying, this news was recorded by lieutenants, policemen, between letters of parishes, army officers, and those like Humphrey O'Sullivan who were social commentators. And some of those were reprinted in the papers. This helps us in mapping the route of the spread of this word about the blessed turf, or the blessed ashes as it started out, and also helps us to see where divergences happened, where changes in the story happened, and also where we can see regional variations in this real-time folklore. So the apparition in Charleville in County Cork, in the south of the country, between midnight in Charleville and 4 a.m. In just 4 hours, it had travelled 40 square miles from Charleville to Mitchelstown, and also towards the Blackwater region. 2 days later, on June 11th, as word was reaching Dublin Castle, it had also reached Laois, then known as Queen's County. At the same time, word had spread to Roscrea in County Tipperary, and this is the first instance we seem to have of the instructions changing. So in a letter to the head police office by Charles Pemberton on the 13th of June 1932, he writes, "The inhabitants of that town were thrown into a state of great alarm by the arrival of a number of strangers from Roscrea, carrying what they called blessed turf, which they stated was anointed by priests, and a portion of which they directed should be distributed through the country. The general impression was that it would prevent cholera, which these strangers represented, prevailed at Roscrea to a great extent." On the same evening, June 11th, word had gotten to Athlone, which is in the Midlands, where it was reported that innumerable messengers had entered the town distributing straws to houses. People were then directed to say certain prayers and then distribute straws themselves to the same effect as the ashes previously. Similar events were also reported in various counties in the surrounding region, such as Roscommon, Westmeath, and also Offaly. It had also travelled south to Kilkenny, where by 5 p.m, large numbers of messengers had arrived distributing turf. So on Monday, June 11th and Tuesday, June 12th, word had spread along the River Barrow, running from Athy in County Kildare to New Ross in County Wexford in the southeast of the country. Reports were seen from Athy, Carlow Town, Bagnallstown, Mullinavat, New Ross, and Waterford. The spread wasn't linear, and how we can tell that is that it would have travelled directly from Bagnallstown to Mullinavat, where places like Borris in County Carlow, which would have been closer to Bagnallstown, weren't reached until after Mullinavat. The message had reached Kildare town at 1 a.m. in the morning, carried by an immense assemblage of persons of the lowest description, consisting of several hundred from the counties of Carlow, Queen's, which was Laois, and King's, which was Offaly. Reported in Bagnallstown, it was said that in a few minutes the town was in agitation, continued so from 11 o'clock p.m. of the 11th till 1 o'clock a.m. of the 12th. The streets were filled with men, women and children. In Carlow Town, it was similarly reported that the whole population of the lower class were in motion through the streets. In Athy, a correspondent reported that some hundreds of people passing and repassing through the town, the greater number barefooted with their coats tucked up as if they were preparing for a journey. Inistioge in County Kilkenny was reached at midnight by a tumultuary body of men amounting to the number of between 50 and 100, part mounted, part on foot, and many of them in their shirts. In Borris, several people reported that they had gone to several different houses in order to find 7 houses which had not been previously visited. You might notice there that we're starting with 4 houses for the ashes, and in Borris we've landed with 7 houses needing to be visited. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But the Night of Straws, or Night of the Blessed Turf, continued on for several more days. So throughout the 12th and 13th of June, it reached Wicklow, Dublin and Cavan. On Tuesday the 12th, a man named Patrick MacDonald was working in fields near Tala in South Dublin and was approached by 5 men, bareheaded and barefooted. They invited him along to distribute blessed turf. He accompanied them as requested, and he got as far as Terranure, which is about 2 miles from the city centre, and then he was captured by police. Nearby in Rathcoole in Dublin, hundreds of the country people could be seen running all over the street carrying pieces of turf. Meanwhile, word had spread to Wexford, where there were hundreds of people reported having come from Carlow and passed through Enniscorthy early on Tuesday morning. By Wednesday the 13th, the message had reached Ballyshannon in County Donegal, and from there the message was brought by boat to Killybeg. The message was then conveyed through this side of the bay by foot messengers running till out of breath, but who were immediately relieved by other fresh ones. This was like a national turf relay where people were running as much as they needed to get to a house to pass this message on, and then they could stop. This spread of the news continued into Ulster on the Thursday. Inishowen residents received instructions to take 4 pieces of straw to put them in every corner of their house. At the same time that the news of how to protect yourself against cholera was spreading, cholera was also spreading, and news of people contracting and dying of cholera was being brought along with the messages of how to protect against it. Now, as we know, in 2022, some 190 years later, socializing and meeting with people and not social distancing can result in the spread of disease. So there is no doubt that in passing on a lot of this information and masses of people moving from town to town and county to county, there was probably transmission of the disease, ironically, during this panic. It's ironic and also tragic because people were very panicked, very afraid of cholera, and just trying to protect themselves in any way that they could. Just to touch on a couple of the changes that happened throughout these few days where the message was spreading around the country. So messengers were asked to share their tokens of protection to either 4, 5 or 7 other houses. There's no clear pattern in the change here, geographically speaking, but in Ballymore Eustace, which is a small town in County Kildare, and also in Arklow in County Wicklow, it was only the 7th person or the 7th household in receipt of the token that had to pass it on to a further 7 people. The token itself, as I said before, started in Charleville with ashes, and that remained the case for the majority of the southeast region. But in Carlow, pieces of turf were used, and also sometimes they were lit, sometimes they weren't lit. Others had pieces of clay, and when the story had reached Athlone, it was pieces of straw, and the pieces of straw continued up to Monaghan, Donegal and Derry. In the South Dublin and Wicklow region in the east of the country, people were instructed to burn the turf at their threshold and then with the ashes make a sign of the cross on their door. In Delgany, County Wicklow, people were instructed to take off their coat, shoes and socks before setting off to bring the message forward. And that would explain some of the reports that we then see in those regions and the surrounding regions of people appearing barefoot and panicked. While in the OG story in Charleville, it was Mary that had appeared and given the instruction. By the time the instructions reached County Laois, it had been said that the turf was blessed by priests. As I mentioned, there was also news circulating at the time with the instructions of people having passed away in great numbers due to cholera, which only added to the panic, putting proverbial fuel on the fire. Pun kind of intended there. One of the more dramatic changes to the story involved fires raining down from heaven. So while cholera was happening and that was panic enough, this unknown disease spreading through the country and people dying, in the southeast, this tale grew a particular set of legs, starting in Ballochmoyler in County Kildare on Monday, the 11th of June. There was no mention of cholera reports. People arriving in this town were bringing word that the town they had come from was destroyed and engulfed in fire. In Bagnallstown in County Carlow, some hour later, it was reported that Rosscray in County Tipperary had also been engulfed. The recipients in that town were distributed ashes to protect their town from the same fate. In Carlow, half an hour later, the news that they got was that Castle Comer nearby had been destroyed by fires from heaven, and similar messages were heard in Dunlavin, County Wicklow, the next day. In Dunlavin specifically, the fires were said to be the cause of a curse placed by Dr. Doyle of the townland, and that the result was a ball of fire destroying County Leith. Here they also stated that 2 angels had come down from heaven and ordered them to say 7 prayers. Other stories in this region and other regions like around the Barrow River in New Ross, County Wexford, there was a promise of a charm that was going to help protect against cholera, and in some places both of these stories existed at the same time. In Enniscorthy, a man was arrested for distributing ash said to have come from County Carlow, blessed by Dr. Doyle, and would not only protect against cholera but also from the fires of heaven. So while a lot of this seems very fantastical, we only need to think that even 190 years later, there was a lot of misinformation spreading around the COVID pandemic as well, and there still is. So while a lot of this might seem fantastical and amusing, we're not that different. Another really important point to note as well is that there was sectarian discrimination involved in this. So not only did you have middle and upper class, predominantly Protestant populations looking down on rural Catholic poor Ireland, there were also Catholic middle class, just as an aside. But the instructions that were given by the messengers of this protection were specifically going to Catholic households. So the information had been given by Catholic clergy, had been distributed from Catholic to Catholic, to the point where some people would arrive at houses, and for people to prove that they were Catholic, they were asked to recite their prayers. So there was sectarian discrimination against Protestants as well, where Protestants were kind of left to fend for themselves, so to speak, and not given the same protection as the Catholics. And as I had said already, there is also this element of trivializing and looking down on the poorer classes in Ireland. Many of the reports are biased, as we saw with the language used by Humphrey O'Sullivan, but also in the language used by the police officers, army officers, and from the middle class in general when reporting on this in the newspapers and in their letters. There's a clear bias against the lower class, and as we have seen throughout history and within Irish stereotyping, there is a lot of bias and a lot of portraying of Irish rural classes as backward, uneducated, superstitious, and just kind of all around ridiculous for believing this kind of thing. Some of the limitations we have when looking at this phenomenon of the Night of the Blessed Turf or the Night of the Straws is that there are gaps in the reports. So we have a lot of report to map the spread of the story, as I've gone through already, but we don't have obviously the oral testimony from what was happening on the ground, how things were changing, who was changing things, what their motives might have been. All of that is kind of lost in the story. And then given the bias of a lot of the reporting, it's not clear whether that reporting can 100% be reliable. So we will never know the full story, but it is really interesting as a snapshot into Irish history and, as I said, folklore in real time, as I usually do with anything historical or folklore and related to Irish traditions specifically. I will always give a cursory look at the National Folklore Schools collection on duchess.ie, and there's a really interesting account which I will link below, which attributes the Night of the Blessed Turf and the Night of the Straws to Daniel O'Connell. So Daniel O'Connell was a famous nationalist politician, particularly known for mobilising the Catholic population of Ireland, and he helped to secure Catholic emancipation in 1823. And this was just 3 years before the Night of the Blessed Turf. So in an account on Duchess entitled The Night of the Straws, this is attributed to Daniel O'Connell and essentially says that Daniel O'Connell was boasting that he could get a message throughout Ireland faster than anybody, and so made a bet with somebody and distributed this story about straws to prove that he could mobilize the country. So I will leave that linked in the description below, along with another article on the Night of the Straws if you'd like to read more about it. What I also found on dukas.ie was a couple of other usages of blessed turf. So it said to cure a sore eye, you just need to waft some of the smoke from burning blessed turf, which I am not recommending this as a cure. And if you want to see more curious cures, I did a video on that a little while ago. It's also said on Holy Thursday, which is the Thursday before Easter, before Mass on this day, people would bring turf, eggs, bread, milk to be blessed. And everybody that brings home a piece of the turf will burn it so that the house doesn't burn down. And another account on Dukas of Pishogues says that if you do not bring home Easter turf or blessed turf from Easter, you won't have a fire for the year. So as I said, those are linked below if you'd like to look into those. So I hope you found that interesting. I certainly did. That came up in one of our classes during our master's year 1 this year, and I thought it would be really, really interesting to do a video on it and to look into it a little bit more. Let me know what you thought below. Have you heard of the Night of the Straws or the Night of the Blessed Turfs before? I hadn't, but I thought it was really interesting. And again, a really interesting snapshot, not only of life in 19th century Ireland, but also just how fast information can get around this small country without any technology or phones or social media. If you want to know more about folklore, I would highly recommend Hagen Dice's recent video on Folklore 101, which goes through what is folklore and touches on some very, very good points on how folklore develops and what constitutes folklore. So go check that out. But for the moment, Sinead, thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up or let me know in the comments, or both. If you'd also like to buy me a coffee, you can do so on ko-fi.com. I will leave the link in the description, and I am posting this from holidays. So I have recorded this before holidays and it should have posted on the 9th of June. So I hope that happened, and I will be back next week with some fresh content. So slán go fóill, I will see you soon.